I will start my presentation by a human story that I have encountered last December in the field. When I was in Kitgum in northern Uganda, I met with some women victims of the LRA. There was one woman named Evelyn. Evelyn, she was kidnapped by the LRA, and she was forcibly married at the age of 12 to one of the commanders, and she bore 3 children to this man. Evelyn was a lucky one because she managed to escape later on. Another woman I met there was Sarah, and these are just names I gave. Sarah she was married to a Kenyan man, and she had a child from that man. And then she was raped by one of the government soldiers, and she bore a child to that man. What happened is that her husband just abandoned her. When she complained about the soldier, she was, in one way, according to a Western perspective of justice, she was a lucky one because the man was convicted and he went to jail. Her perspective of the story is different. Sarah argued that she lost both ways because she was abandoned by her husband, but she was also lost the chance that the man who wronged her would marry her. She has no financial support to support the 2 children, and she's just on the street. So Evelyn and Sarah are in a women organization that tries and look after them. The women's story, they said that the worst thing that ever happened to them is their separation from the men who we call the LRA commanders, or, their perpetrators. The complexity, I'm telling you this story because the complexity of the situation on the ground challenges any perceptions of justice that we have. I was talking to Nancy. Nancy had children from an LRA commander, and she said, he was an LRA commander, but he was also the father of the children. To the children, he is their father. They never saw him around with a gun. This is the story of people in Kitgum in northern Uganda. It's an area that is completely cut off. You will have to, in order to reach Kitgum, you need about 9 hours, from Kampala, sorry. So I'm telling you this story just to relate how things, for instance, at the level of the UN Security Council can translate on the ground and what impact could they have. It's very interesting. Sexual violence is a very complex phenomenon. It has so many and wide-reaching consequences. It has health consequences, it has economic consequences, it has consequences on the children born out of rape. How do we deal with this? This is particularly important when we're dealing with, peacemaking and peace agreement, which is the subject of my article. Particularly when Western actors are involved in crusade or of liberal peacemaking that is largely insensitive to the victim's needs. So I would say, in my article, I looked at the development in international law, and I argued that during the last 2 decades there has been a lot of development in terms of the normative law, in terms of bringing perpetrators to justice. Most notably of these is the ICC, which is the Rome Statute, but also the ICTR, the work of the tribunals, both in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, which for the first time they have recognized and prosecuted sexual violence against women as crimes against humanity. Yet, development in international criminal law and international human rights law, they have many shortcomings. First of all, they suffer from selectiveness, because not all victims are prosecuted. International criminal law silenced the victim. This story came from, Evelyn herself. She said she never had a chance to tell her own story, and she's looking for a platform. International criminal law, the victims are only witnesses there. They cannot tell the story the way they experienced it. Sometimes the effect of the crime on the victim is more important than the crime itself, but they never have a chance to say that. They just dare to answer questions by the court. And therefore they experience re-victimization. So sometimes these structures that we really worked hard to have, these structures that we have set up to dispense justice for victims becomes another source of alienation and subordination for the victims themselves. And that is one of the criticisms that I have for the Agenda on Women, Peace and Security. The Agenda on Women, Peace and Security reproduces the shortcomings of international law in dealing with sexual violence against women. The situation of peace agreements it's a very complex situation. Peace agreements are the result of a bargain between mediators, peace mediators, donors, and parties to the conflict. And in this bargain, there is a trade-off between justice and amnesty, justice and peace. One thing for sure is that if you insist on a wholesale prosecution, you can never have a peace agreement. Justice for women in these circumstances have been in the past totally ignored. Even when transitional justice mechanisms are set up to prosecute or to compensate victims, women are always left out. The emphasis of these transitional justice mechanisms is basically on the perpetrators. The victims are silenced. The victims are nowhere there. So justice in the form of prosecutions, this international form of justice, is actually fails to address the woman's situation. There is a complete lack of understanding of justice as compensation, justice as restoration, justice as reparation, and I would say this, justice as development. If we separate development from justice, there can be no justice. A system that only deals with the perpetrators and with the effect of the crime can never deal with gender-based violence. The Agenda on Women, Peace and Security, and in particular the later resolutions, they focus on rape as a weapon of war. While rape as a weapon of war has its validity, we have to acknowledge that in times of conflict, rape is not only practiced as a weapon of war. Rape is practiced as form of domestic violence. Rape is practiced as form of the spoil of war. Rape is practiced out of the craziness, out of criminality. By emphasizing the Agenda on Women, Peace and Security, one of the shortcomings that I discusses in the article is its focus basically on dealing with sexual violence as a weapon of war. So other forms of violence against women, they completely get blurred. Gender gets blurred, and violence becomes something that men do to women. So it obscures other forms of violences. It obscures the reasons behind, the underlying reasons behind the violence, the vulnerability of the victims, and the identities of the victims. One of the issues that I allude to in the paper is the fact, for instance, in Afghanistan, when we're dealing with violence against women, we forgot the phenomenon, I haven't seen it until very recently, of Bashabazi, which is violence against young men, which is sexual enslavement of young men. So by portraying violence against gender-based violence as violence against women, we kind of oversimplify and blur the situation, and we fail really to provide solutions for Evelyn and for other women on the ground. Yeah, just okay. So my paper looked at peace agreements since the adoption of the resolution. One thing my research actually, the findings is that since the adoption of the resolution, there is more mentioning, more references to women and peace agreements. So on that level, there has been some sort of achievements. Yet, justice for gender-based violence in peace agreements even is still missing, and very few agreements deal with that. And when these agreements deal with justice for gender-based violence, they generally deal with it as accountability, in terms of punishment rather than restoration or compensation or dealing with the victim's needs, and that is very problematic. I think the other thing is, as Sophie was talking about, is that we have to be careful, because in the context of international peacemaking and international actors involved in peacemaking activities in developing world, we have to be careful that this resolution and the whole agenda on women, peace and security does not become another justification for war waging and for colonial projects that have nothing to do with women well-being. If we would like to dispense justice for victims, then we have to look broader and to try and achieve a more holistic approach to justice rather than just focused on the perpetrator in our hands.